Okay. So the next category, Margie, why don't you take that one? Because I think this is applied to kind of your experience a little bit.
Before we do that, there is a comment I do want to talk about. I might add a bullet such as victims of sexual abuse.
We're getting there.
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right.
Thank you. Coming up.
It's coming up.
Thank you. I thought we had to skip that. Sorry.
Nope. We're on bullet number 4.
I digress.
Okay. Bullet number 4. We'll get there next, Natasha.
So the next point would be those who develop sympathies for a discriminated minority group. So it's usually in the form of a close friend or a family member. Yeah, that's kind of back to proximity and connection with other people and their stories. So for me, this came to me when we lived in Seattle, and I was really close to my cousin growing up. And he actually came out to me during that time. And the way he did it, it allowed me to feel for his journey and the torment he felt. And it's interesting because he wasn't raised religious at all. He didn't attend a church at all. But the extent to which he personally suffered with this piece of himself, and he is the kindest, just the most giving, loving, just puts all manner of goodness on the planet, was a real eye-opener for me. And I think something literally just shifted in that conversation to make the space bigger, where I just thought, this is wrong. I am now different. I see things in a different way.
Right.
I once had somebody say to me, John, you cover LGBT stuff way too much on Mormon Stories. You may as well rename it Gay Mormon Stories. And they would say, it's just not my issue. Mm-hmm. And it's just, all I had to say is, it's very common for it not to be your issue until it becomes your issue. And when it's your child or your brother or your parent who, becomes divorced or is LGBT or becomes a feminist or stumbles on intellectual issues, and then causes them distress, pain, causes them to suffer, and or causes them to leave. All we're saying here is not only being a discriminated or marginalized minority group can cause you to leave, being friends or family members with a discriminated, marginalized member of a minority group can also cause you to question and or leave.
Anytime that we have that tendency to be disinterested because it's not our issue is a good reminder that that's a position of privilege.
That's right.
Love that. So
we really need to make these things our issues, especially when we don't have a lot of lived experience, because then that means that you're probably not in a space where people can trust you or come out to you or talk to you about things, because with that sort of attitude, we're difficult to approach.
Yes, crucial.
All right. Natasha, why don't you do the 5th bullet?
All right. So experience some sort of abuse in a church context. So
you deal with this a lot, right?
Yes, I do deal with this a lot. There's obviously what I would call direct types of issues where there's been an actual, maybe ecclesiastical leader or somebody within church authority who has really misstepped, so whether that's
give some examples,
like sexual abuse, like actual sexual abuse. You have a priesthood leader or even an auxiliary leader who has sexually abused you in a church context,
or verbally or physically.
Verbally, physically, or sexually. Yeah. And I think that there's also indirect. So in other words, you've experienced sexual abuse, let's say, for example, and you come in to a bishop's office and start talking about something like that. But now it's turning into talk about repentance or confessing, or the bishop isn't trained well enough to understand what you're even talking about. And so maybe like a date rape situation is now being treated as a consensual dating experience that both people are held equally responsible for, or because there are a lot of dynamics within Mormonism, like in most tribes, where you try to self-protect. Maybe a person comes in and says, something's happening in my home with my father or my step-parent, or my uncle, but that person is a person of weight and, somebody who's trusted within the community. So then it's hard to believe this minor or this child or this wife, that is saying, hey, there's domestic violence or there's something in my home. And so it can be kind of indirectly abuse. It's an indirect abuse where the ecclesiastical leader isn't holding that story and that with the authority and accountability that it should have been held with. It isn't reported to authorities. It isn't taken seriously. Maybe that person is told, well, can you be forgiving? Or are you sure? They're not believed, or they're expected to be forgiving in those situations. So we could do 5 hours of podcasting just in how people experience some sort of abuse in a church context, whether that's direct, somebody at church actually abused you, mistreated you, did something either criminal or emotionally traumatizing to you, or indirect. So the numbers of people that fall into this category are tremendous, tremendous. I would say there's probably more people that fall into this category than don't.
Yeah, and I can also see, give me the correct stat on sexual assault, Natasha. Is it 1 in 4 women?
So 1 in 3 women currently report some type of unwanted sexual advance prior to the age of 18.
Yeah.
And 1 in, I think it's either 7 or 8 men do. The male reporting still feels like it's probably underreported because there's so much stigma of being a male who wants anything unwanted that is sexual. We tend to talk about men like anything should be wanted. So very, very difficult for men to know when something has been unwanted, or even if they know it was unwanted, to know how to talk about it.
Yeah. But even if you take something like that and you move it to indirect, so now we're going to say it didn't happen in a church context directly, but then you put that, the person who experienced that in young women's, for example, where you're having lessons and virtue is prized above all. And that's what you're hearing. And
that's even less than indirect. Like I would say there's direct, there's indirect, like with the bishop who's actually saying something, but then there's like this, like just cultural, like aura, right? That's aura of, you're just kind of, you listen to a lesson on virtue, like you're saying, and all of a sudden you're seeing yourself as unworthy or less than.
Exactly.
And nobody did it wasn't even in part of a worthiness interview. It wasn't anything directly said to you, but just something that was said in general, and how we have these scripts and narratives and rhetoric within Mormonism that is very damaging. Absolutely. And so then you leave feeling like you kind of get the idea, I'm unworthy. I'm not, I don't fit in. My story isn't the ideal.
Yep.
So just like that can affect singles and all that, but it definitely can affect people who've had any type of sexual abuse, physical abuse in the home, especially like what if your father is like, the, I don't know, the elders quorum president, right? But is beating everybody at home, or you have a mother who is a raging alcoholic at home, but is, teaching primary at church. These are very complex things that, especially when you're growing up in the church, it's very hard to tie that ideal with what's happening in your own home environment. And the reality is that Mormons are just as dysfunctional as other people, in relation to all of these statistics. We don't beat anybody. The only statistics I think we do better at than the general population are things like drinking, not smoking, and we're more highly educated than the general population. But as far as family relational dynamics, I don't see statistics that make Mormons better than other families.
Yes.
Absolutely. And this is, and then there can be minor things. Wendy writes, ostracized in senior year of high school. Seminary teacher went after school district for subscribing to Ms. Magazine. This was during the push for the ERA. It doesn't have to be, it can also be just mean or rude comments or bullying or, things that people experience. A leader can degrade a kid about what they're wearing, whether they're modest or not, whether they're, dancing too close to somebody, but just do it in a way that's kind of offensive and hurtful. And like you guys said, shaming. Or it can be an LGBT youth that is, or adult that's taught to, be celibate or be in a mixed orientation marriage, or even try reparative or conversion therapy.
Mhm.
Those things can end up feeling abusive if you end up missing a lot of those happy years, or marrying someone you shouldn't have married, or trying to change yourself that can be psychologically harmful. All of these things can be harmful. And
They are abusive, yeah.
yeah, they are abusive. And the final thing I'll say is, this is where that trope or that stereotype around being offended can really have a dark side. Because, you know, if I'm sexually abused by a leader, anytime I attend church again, or hear certain hymns, or hear prayers, or just be in a Mormon context, that can be very triggering. You know, it can trigger a traumatic response. You become, you know, diagnosable with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so how awful or minimalizing is it for us to sort of say, oh, you were just offended, when in reality, attending church for whatever reason might actually literally cause stressful, triggering, traumatic responses that can make you feel panic attacks, or worse, like you're going to die, or just so that you're constantly miserable. And that's when these stereotypes become from just sort of a little bit devaluing or demeaning to deeply potentially harmful.
Yep.
And it doesn't even have to be bullying or kind of shamey, you know, like, oh, don't do that. What's so sad is that you can have the most loving bishop say, and this happened to me, loving bishop, like super wonderful man, like would do anything for me. And, you know, just saying, you know, something like, Natasha, I'm just so concerned, you know, with all this love in his eyes. And just because, you know, you've done something that is only second to murder. And I love you so much. And I want you to, you know, be able to repent from this. Well, that was done in a very loving, you know, like I did feel a lot of love from the man who told me something that really had an abusive impact on me. Yep. So even in the best of scenarios, with the most loving tone and love and true, genuine concern, we're so uneducated and so in trauma-informed care that we are re-traumatizing, re-victimizing without even knowing that we're doing that in ways that people are just really having lifelong implications from some of these scenarios.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I don't know how most of us don't really escape unscathed from that. I think there's just too much. And that's what I mean by the tension between best standards of care practice and the narrative. It's just it's too at odds.
Right.
Yep.
And this isn't to say that people can't heal from trauma, that people are going to be eternal victims, and that once you've had a really bad experience at church, you can never stay. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying that everyone who experiences trauma in a Mormon context will leave the church or should leave the church. There can be healing and grace and repentance and forgiveness. You know, those
and there's post-traumatic growth. You know, we know the research on post-traumatic growth, where people can take traumatic events and actually really bloom and thrive from the experiences that they had once they have certain tools and strategies in place.
We want to leave room for all of that, and to say, if the church becomes a traumatic place for somebody, sometimes they either need to leave it or take a sabbatical or heal before they can re-engage partially or fully. And, you know, we need to just have empathy for that instead of judgment and ridicule.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, the last one I'm going to claim, because it's sort of my, the last main domain. It's sort of something that I've, you know, it's kind of what led me out, or at least led me into a faith crisis. And it's one of the most common domains in the, you know, modern internet age. And that's exposure to historical or doctrinal problems that cause you to question and challenge the church's truth claims. So often it's not wanting, you know, to learn the seedy stuff or digging into, quote, anti-Mormon literature, unquote. Oftentimes it just starts as you're a Sunday school teacher or a seminary teacher. You want to prepare a great lesson, or you're Googling Joseph Smith or on YouTube, and a weird video comes up, or somebody mentions offhand something like the CES letter or a podcast or whatever it is, all of a sudden you start learning things that you had never been taught before within a Mormon context. Maybe it's that Joseph Smith didn't translate the Book of Mormon using a Urim and Thummim and golden plates, but instead he used a hat and a white seer stone or a brown seer stone. Maybe it's that Joseph Smith engaged in treasure digging with his family as a young adult. Maybe it's that the Book of Abraham, the translation of the Book of Abraham from Egyptian English didn't pan out the way that the church thought it would once humans learned to read Egyptian. Or maybe it's thinking about the Book of Mormon and what we call anachronisms, realizing that the Book of Mormon mentions horses and steel during a time period where steel and horses weren't available to Native Americans. Maybe it's learning about Joseph Smith's polygamy, that he had 30 plus wives, or married other men's wives, which is called polyandry, or maybe it's that he married 14 or 15-year-olds, or sisters, or mother-daughter pairs, or that he sent men on missions and then married their wives or approached their wives. There are historical issues with the church. All of these things that I just mentioned are 100% certified and validated from the modern LDS church as credible, legitimate concerns. And then there's sort of learning about the church's racist past, statements Brigham Young made about it being evil to be in a mixed race or mixed racial marriage, or that dark people were cursed by God in the pre-existence. Some of those things that we taught, blood atonement, teachings of Brigham Young, Adam God theory, where Brigham Young taught that.
Do you just bring all this out of your head?
Doctrinal.
Like, holy cow! Does this just kind of come out? I'm like, yep, check. I'm like, wow.
There's a lot. There are a lot of things that can cause someone to
which
doubt
we
a question.
can't go into all of them right now.
No.
Come on, this is my moment. This is my bullet. You guys be quiet.
I am impressed.
We're interrupting his bullet. This is really bad, Margie.
Yeah. And I'll just round out the categories. It can also be social justice stuff, learning that the church fought the Equal Rights Amendment for women, or fought the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, or that the church encouraged electroshock therapy as a form of conversion therapy on LGBT people. Mountain Meadows Massacre, that there was a cover-up, with Brigham Young. All these things and many more. You can go to mormonthink.com. You can go to cesletter.org. You can go to Mormon Stories Podcast. You can read, No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brody. You can read Rough Stone Rolling by Richard Bushman. There are a million books or websites or podcasts or PDFs that will make you, or even the church put out a series of essays called the Gospel Topics Essays.
Yeah, that might be a place where believers might be more comfortable to start off with.
Oh, well, I'm not recommending that people look into these things.
Well, when they're curious about it.
These are all sources that become jumping off points for a faith crisis.
Right.
And the Gospel Topics Essays, which the church released in an attempt to become more transparent and to educate people and to sort of atone for its maybe less than fully open and honest history, even those Gospel Topics Essays have become the impetus for many people starting to doubt and question and begin a faith crisis.
Right.
So all of these issues can become the reasons why people have a faith crisis. And again, none of this is anti-Mormon literature. All of this is factual, historical, truthful stuff. For the most.
History is messy. People are messy. And we didn't want to deal with our messiness for a long time, which creates a lot of cognitive dissonance on so many of these issues. So it's part, I think, of being a fledgling organization. I mean, we're only a few hundred years old. We're not like the Catholics and the Jews. And so it's the growing pains that we're currently going through. And I would hope believers, can understand that that's kind of a normal thing to have happen.
Mm-hmm.
So some people might look at those historical things and not be too bothered by them, like kind of just explain it away like I just did, things happen. And for other people, it's legitimate, like, well, but that doesn't match the truth claims that I was told. And so that becomes a real reason for me to see this as invalid. And I think we need to make space for that spectrum of how people respond to these historical things.
Totally. I run into people who say to me, oh, my parents taught me about the peep stone in the hat and polygamy when I was 4, and they've never had a faith crisis as a result. And
right.
So you're right, Natasha. We're not saying that everybody has to have a faith crisis when they learn about this stuff. It's just one of the common jumping off points for some people.
Yeah, exactly.
Shout out to Jennifer, who writes that learning that suicide attempts are high in Utah can be an impetus for a faith crisis, or even that on Sundays or around general conference times, these can be troubling and triggering for many people. Thanks, Jennifer, for sharing that. Okay, a lot of comments are laughing at me for getting carried away. So thanks, Jana and Rochelle and others. Rochelle says, you guys, okay, Rochelle's sticking up for my point of view. Rochelle writes, you guys are laughing, but that's me when somebody asks why I left the church. It's where to start. So many places to start.
Right.
So Rochelle understands me. Thank you, Rochelle. you get me. You complete me. No, I'm just kidding. You complete me.
Whoa.
But thanks for the validation, Rochelle. Okay.
Oh, Betty.
So these are the 6 main categories that I've identified, or that we've identified, as main reasons or causes for why people have a faith crisis. And I should add, there are lots of people that stay in spite of all these things. So you can go to, a Thoughtful Faith podcast or Mormon Matters podcast or Fair Mormon, and you can find all sorts of explanations for all this stuff, justifications, people who've made peace with this stuff. So again, none of this is a foregone conclusion. Finally, I guess I wanted to close this session by talking about a few other factors that I personally associate with a faith crisis, sometimes not causation, but correlation. And we can touch on each one individually just as a way to close. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. The first one is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this is going to be a little bit complicated and sensitive, but sometimes I refer to a faith crisis as correlating with privilege. And here's what I mean by that. If you are, let's just say, a single mom in Detroit who's struggling to just work 3 jobs, make ends meet, and you need support raising your kids, you're probably going to be in a very different position in terms of having the luxury of thinking about or worrying about a lot of these issues relative to somebody who's, retired, wealthy, highly educated, fully independent, and would have friends and family no matter what their relationship with the church was, and would have all the support they need in every area. So I kind of mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The higher up you go on the Maslow's hierarchy, sometimes, not always, but occasionally can correlate with a privilege that allows you to have the luxury of even contemplating a faith crisis. Now, do either of you object to that idea?
Oh, well, I would qualify it. That's what I would do. I would say, so like looking at the 6 categories, you could see that for some of the categories and probably not for others, right? So like LGBT, for people that don't fit within the Mormon culture, that probably wouldn't be true. Abuse, that probably wouldn't be true. No. So with qualifiers, that's all I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. But you're okay with that general principle, Natasha?
Yeah, I would agree with Margi. I mean, if you're a lesbian, in Detroit that's has had like lots of sexual abuse history, and her bishop, is being rude, then yeah, she might totally have a faith transition or crisis, whereas if you've got somebody who's really maybe only going to be affected maybe more by the historical stuff and working the 3 jobs, then
a woman of color, woman of color experiencing Mormonism would not be in a place of privilege, and that probably isn't part of her.
Right. So just so you guys know, I'm assuming the 6 past things we've already talked about as being true, and I'm just adding some other factors that could.
Yeah. No, I think for some people, what we do need to understand is that some people really, you know, and I know we'll go into this a little bit more, but when it comes to needs, I mean, a big part of our needs is social connection with people. Mm-hmm. And regardless of what's going on with all these other 6 areas, a place to meet every week, a church where you know that somebody can bring you a casserole if needed, meets those needs. And I think that's what John's getting at, is that's very powerful to have that in your life.
Yeah, and we're going to totally get to that. Perfect. Okay, the next one I have is family factors. So I would say the more that you're a multi-generational Mormon, the more that you've got that pioneer stock, the more that your parents and your grandparents and your spouse and your children are Orthodox members, the more the more difficult it's going to be able to contemplate and pursue a faith crisis. Would you guys disagree with that correlation?
I don't know. I think that this would be one of those things that I just have a lot of anecdotal data on. I don't know. Do we have data on this?
Nope. These are my theories. But yeah. I'm just going to say that if your wife is a non-Mormon and you are looking at the precipice of a faith crisis, it might be a little bit easier, all else being equal, than if your wife is an Orthodox Mormon who may leave you if she finds out you're doubting.
Yeah.
Do you understand? I'm not trying to say that everyone, obviously I'm a multi-generational Mormon. Obviously there are multi-generational Mormons who leave. That's not my point.
Right, but I guess what you're conflating is orthodoxy with whether or not you're multi-generational or whether you're converts, right? And so I come from a convert family. Sometimes I ask myself this question, you know, like there's nothing intergenerationally holding me necessarily to Mormonism, and yet I feel so profoundly connected to it. And I know very many Orthodox families that would probably consider leaving their spouse, even though they are converts themselves, right? So I guess I'm just wondering about the conflation between, I do think that there's more intergenerational investment, obviously, and there's a story and there's an identity there with being part of the pioneer story. And so I would assume that as well. I'm just not sure I'm ready to completely, and yeah.
All I'm saying is I'm not saying it's causal. I'm just saying sometimes it can be a factor.
Yeah.
So you know what?
That's all I'm saying. We don't necessarily need to sort of
like totally understand it.
These are we could reframe
these
this.
Are potential factors.
We could reframe this in a way that will make this easier.
Solve it, Margie.
It's like observations you've had. that effect with people that you've seen. You've seen a lot of people, you've coached a lot of people. Absolutely. These are observations that you have noticed, you know, things that you've observed in people.
And that's why I started with the stipulation, this is correlation, not causation, right? So these are just some factors. Yeah. These are some factors. Clear. Okay. Again,
yes.
if your spouse has left the church and all your kids are out and your parents are all out,
that affects
and there's no family member that's in the church,
it's going to be easier for sure.
Easier.
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you.
I would agree with that.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, that was hard.
But you also want us to be, I mean,
keep us honest. Mm-hmm. Okay. This is hard. Okay. Another one is social factors. If all your friends are Orthodox Mormons, and if all your community is Orthodox Mormon, and that's where you get your source of friends and community, I'm going to posit that it may, for some, be harder to leave the church than if you have no Mormon friends, no Mormon community, and all your friends and community members are outside the church. Are you guys okay with that?
Yes.
Yeah, and I would even add one. If you have children where that's true too, you know, because that's something I see is parents will make different choices if their children are in an environment where it's very conservative Mormon, it's important socially, you see different, I'm with you.
We're good, Natasha?
Yes, agreed.
Okay. Another one I found is personality factors. I think there are some people, there's a book I think that's called The Believing Brain. I think science more and more is going to find out and discover, and is discovering, that some people just genetically, biologically, hormonally, whatever it is, they're just more inclined to a believing disposition. And there are some people that are just more inclined to a skeptical non-believing disposition. And you know, there are no absolutes here, but I think sometimes personality traits can factor in. What do you guys think?
I totally believe that there are personality traits. And even some of the intergenerational stuff that's coming out as far as what we pass down. Like there's so many things that we just don't even understand about ourselves, right? Or about each other that are subconscious, that are built into our wiring, whether it's through the study of addiction, the study of faith transitions. I mean, we all, same stimulus, same information, we all go about it different ways. Why is that? You know, there's so many different factors. So I would definitely put personality traits as part of that.
And one other that I found is just introverted people. Sometimes introverted people will say to me, I didn't go to the church because I liked it. I hated it, but I went because I thought it was true. But once I had reasons to question it, it was very easy for me to leave because I always hated going anyway. So introverts, I've noticed a loose correlation with introverts.
I do feel like my experience of being introverted, it created a different dynamic with the community part than say with you, who's a little bit more extroverted and a little bit, I can see that.
Yeah, the flip side's true too. I did not want to leave because I loved the social interactions at church.
Yeah, could I add a personality too?
Please.
So I know for me as well, loving structure and stability, that allowed for me to appreciate certain parts of the church as well, because I loved the format, the ritual, the tradition, that sort of underlying stability and predictability that it gave to my life.
Yeah.
That allowed for a buy-in that may not have been there if I was more of a rebel or a questioner, or, you know, super artistic about how, and more explorative.
More abstract.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How about you, Natasha? Have you noticed any personality traits that you might correlate loosely with church, with a likelihood or an unlikelihood to go through a faith crisis?
I can't think of any that you haven't both already mentioned, but I do think it would be an interesting study in of itself, is just looking at certain personality traits, because there's a variety of them. Yeah.
As a next bullet, talk to us about the validity versus utility sort of trade-off or personality type, because you talk about this a lot, and I first learned this from Dr. Dave Christian, but you talk about this quite well. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think Dr. Dave Christian was the first one that I heard using the term validity and utility. I had kind of had these ideas or concepts before I heard him talk about it, and I think I've heard other people talk about it as well, but it's hard sometimes to give credit to anything psychological, because we all have ideas that get reused. But I think that, and we've kind of talked about it already, even with Margi mentioning kind of this idea of, you know, stability and things like that. So there's this, the validity utility is kind of like two buckets. And one is validity, which is kind of like truth, right? So is it true? Is it real? Is it factual? And the other bucket is it useful? Does it serve my purposes, right? And so you can have people, for example, that see it as a true story, Mormonism, let's say. And even though they're gay, or even though they're a person of color, or even though they're a feminist, right, or whatever, but they still see it true. And so then their lived experience, even if it's not useful or even if it's harmful, they still go, because that they're more under that bucket of validity. Whether I like going, whether I'm bored, whether it's useful at all to me, it doesn't matter, because it's true. So I have to go. Or sometimes, the term Jack Mormon, right, is kind of that these people are kind of under that too, where, well, I stopped going because it wasn't useful to me, but I still find it true. It's still true. There's still that truth to it. They still hold on to. And then there's the bucket of usefulness, which is, well, I don't know if it all needs to be true. And these are the people that maybe when they hear historical facts, it's not as impactful to them, because it's like, well, okay, maybe Joseph Smith made a few mistakes, right? Or maybe Brigham Young or whoever, like, what do you expect? But it's useful to me. It's where I go for my community. It's where I can raise my kids. It's like where I feel, respected. It's where I have a calling and feel part of a community. It's where I feel loved and supported. And like I said, we can call in for a casserole when needed, right? And so it's a very useful part of my life. Therefore, the truth is not going to be as important. So what I found is working with faith transitioners is one of those buckets gets tipped over in a way that the person wasn't expecting. And that's oftentimes the impetus, right? So it's not necessarily it's just a way to talk about what we've been talking about this whole podcast, just kind of it's almost like a model, if you want to put forth that way. And then there's implications for both, because obviously it's not like we're all either or. It just, you tend to lean into one bucket more than the other.
And early in my faith crisis sort of coaching years, I associated the validity paradigm more to being male, that men tended to care more about the truth claims than women, and that women tended to say, I don't care about the truth claims. It's where I want to raise my kids. I feel comfortable there. It works for me. And since then, I think those correlations have been challenged quite a bit. And I'm not sure how strongly I feel like those tend to be male versus female.
That would be interesting data as well, because I would have made that assumption as well, because of the whole idea that women are relational, right? They're the mothers, they're, especially in our Mormon narrative, the comforters. But in my anecdotal experience, that hasn't really shown up that way. I've had lots of women be the people starting a faith transition journey within their marriage due to a lot of validity concerns. So it hasn't resonated for me.
Yeah. And I once did a mixed faith marriage retreat, and we had 20 couples, and literally 10 of the couples, the men left first, were the non-believers, and 10 of the couples, the women were non-believers. And the reasons were all over the board. So,
all over the place. Yeah.
Okay, 2 more, and then we're going to be done with this episode, I think, along with any other final thoughts. I think we can say that there can be a loose correlation with age. We know that millennials are leaving the church at a higher rate than people who are older. That's not just true for Mormonism, but that's true for most, religious traditions in the United States. And you can reference the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, from the Pew Foundation for that data. Younger people are disaffiliating for religion at the highest rates. On the flip side, and this is something I want to give a shout out to Jennifer again for highlighting, there is sort of this sunk cost fallacy that many of us can fall privy to. If you're 60 or 70 or 80 and you've given your whole life to the church, I think there are strong psychological pressures to not want to consider that you've given your whole life to a fraud or to something that isn't true, and to be hesitant to allow yourself to experience a faith crisis.
Even consider it.
If you're older. What were you saying, Natasha?
Yeah, to even consider it.
Yeah. You agree, Margie?
Mm-hmm.
But again, Sam Young's mom, Birdie, she's like 80 and she's gone through a faith crisis. And, they're obviously very devout teenagers and young adults who are very committed. So these are loose correlations, not.
Well, and I think that some of the differences that we're seeing in the current data, in my understanding with the youth, I think that the younger generation has always been more likely to leave religion. But with the caveat that a lot of times people would return to their religions of, their traditional religions once they started having kids. I think we're seeing less of that. And we're also seeing higher numbers of youth leaving religion. So that's where I think I think developmentally, when you think about it, what are you supposed to be doing when you're 18, 19, 20? You're supposed to be rebelling, right? You're supposed to be saying, I want to go try my own thing. I want to do something different. So I think even going way back, the research would show that people maybe tend to drop off from religious traditions typically when they're younger, but then would return. I'm not sure we're seeing that return.
Yep. I totally validate and agree with that.
Yeah.
The final dimension that I have as a correlate is your job or your financial situation dependent on the church or the church community? The classic example I have are like, dear friends of ours who are doctors in a Mormon town, or employees of CES, or working at the church office building, or an insurance salesman or a chiropractor or whatever. or a
A
scrapbooker,
student at BYU.
Mm-hmm.
student at BYU, a teacher at BYU, multi-level marketer, whatever it is. If your job depends on connecting with devout Orthodox Mormons, it's going to be a lot harder to feel the freedom and the ability, or even be open to a faith crisis, if it would mean significant financial distress or catastrophe. And I know people who just fake it at church, and they go through a faith crisis. They just don't tell anyone, or they keep it very private because they can't sustain the financial distress, or they don't want to experience the financial discomfort that would accompany a faith crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
All right, Natasha, is there any other major category? We've kind of done an exhaustive list here. Is there any other major category you want to add, or any final thoughts on this topic?
No, I don't think so. I the only thing that's coming up for me as far as my own experience, and I'm not sure where to fit it in, so maybe you guys can help me, because I'm guessing we already covered it, but I just remember being very afraid of certain things. Like fear was a big kind of awful motivator for a long time in my life, right? So fear that if I didn't repent of certain things, I wouldn't, end up in the celestial kingdom, or fear that if I didn't have a year's, supply of food, that the second coming would come and I'd be unprepared. Fear that if I wasn't up to date on my tithing, fear, right? And so, so I guess maybe this is kind of with the resonating type of things that we were talking about, but I'd like to talk about fear in particular, just kind of as a separate emotion, because I think for me, what I started recognizing was that it was just an unhealthy space for me to be in. And it was an empowering moment for me to finally say, I will no longer be motivated by fear of not being good enough, of not checking off all the boxes I'm supposed to be checking, of not having repented the right way, of not, whatever all those things are. Maybe it's perfectionistic culture, right? Or whatever we want to talk about. So fit that in where you want to for me. But I just wanted to mention that I think for me anyway, having to, for my own mental health, step away from fear being a primary motivator was an important thing. So that's maybe a usefulness thing. It wasn't useful for me to be motivated by fear.
We see that a lot when parents have children and they've been conditioned to think that you can't raise a happy, healthy, moral kid outside of Mormonism. People just say, well, I can't leave the church. My kids are in it, and I'm worried that they'll become drug dealing prostitutes if I leave the church, and it may sound like I'm making light of that, but people really wonder, can a healthy, happy kid be raised outside of the church? And it's just conditioning based on fear.
Yeah, some paradigms that we've been handed down.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Natasha.
All right.
Anything you want to add?
I don't think so. I feel like we've done a wonderful intro.
All right.
To common causes.
Well, good. Well, a lot of people have stuck with us, and so we just want to give a shout out to our audience for going the distance. We're 2 hours and 20 minutes in, and we'll be splitting this up into multiple episodes. But we're really grateful for everyone who shared comments and questions.
Yeah.
Jana lets us know that Sam Young's mom, Bertie, has been out of the church for a long time. That's true. Although I think she resigned recently, but I could be wrong about that. Let's see. Aaron writes, yes, fear, big time. My biggest reason for staying as long as I did was fear. So Aaron is validating your point, Natasha. Bethany says, this discussion was so well done. Thank you. Bethany, if you or others feel that way, what we would really appreciate is those of you who are willing to sort of consider becoming monthly subscribers. Just $10 a month, anything. We would love to get 100 donors to be able to donate $10 a month. And if we do, we can pay Margi for her time. We can pay Natasha for her time. I'm even comfortable not being paid for my time, but I definitely want Natasha and Margi to be paid.
I would like all of us to be paid for our time. We're not going to do some weird benefactory patriarchal thing.
Okay. I'm just saying, if you value this for yourself or for others, please go to mormonfaithcrisis.com and consider contribution. Victoria writes, I would like to make a donation, but when I went onto the website, the only option I found is a monthly donation. I'm self-employed and I'm not sure I can donate monthly. Is there a way we can make donations as and when we can afford it? There might be other people in the same position as me that might be able to donate on a one-time basis. Yes, Victoria.
Great question.
I'm going to add a single donation button right now to the website as soon as we're done, and we'll invite those of you who don't want to make a monthly donation to do so. Maybe I'll also add a $1 a month or a $5 a month donation as well, so that people can donate at a very low amount if they'd prefer. But thank you, Victoria, for that suggestion.
Yes.
And thanks to everyone. Again, thanks to Courtney, our single donor. And thanks to anyone else who's willing to contribute. We will do this for a while until we either can't sustain it or we get that support. So thanks to all our listeners. But there are other ways that people can support us. And so I'm going to list them all right now. If you enjoy this stuff and value it, but you're not able to donate financially, you could like our Facebook page. You could give the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis Facebook page a positive 5-star review. You could share it with friends and family. You can comment. You can send us emails to recommend suggestions, to share your life perspective, your tips, your tricks, your mistakes. You can email us, and you can just let people know about what's going on and spread the word. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Let's end, as we try to, by some homework. Margie, do you want to give them some homework?
I actually really would love to hear Natasha's idea on her homework.
All right, Natasha, what do you want to share?
Are you talking about the idea that I wrote down, or are you just talking about in general? Okay. All right. So I was thinking about, because we're thinking about doing this every podcast, is leaving you with some thoughts. And so my general idea for homework to be useful is, and not that you have to do this every time, and not that we'll offer something in each category every time, but I think it's important to do something with your brain. So it's kind of intellectual process, right? So whether that's journaling or writing a comment or, doing reading a material, those are all kind of brain activities. I think it's important to do something with your body so that it starts filtering down from your brain, because just because you know something new doesn't mean you know something new, right? So I think that, so whether it's breathing exercises or a ritual or, something where some of the self-care stuff that we've been talking about, that can be helpful. I think it's important to do something possibly in community. So whether you share something with your spouse or a friend, or maybe go to a certain community to have a certain experience so that you consider yourself as homework. Or do something in repetition, because again, our brains are wired to, they can shift and change, but they probably won't if you don't offer it repetition in order for it to do so. So whether that's a mantra you repeat every day, right? Or a little ritual that you do daily to help yourself, in faith transition. So, those are just my ideas as far as in general, how I'd like to organize some of the homework that we give to people after these podcasts. But do either one of you have an idea as far as what you could offer that would fit into one of those categories from what we talked about today? What would be homework from understanding your own common causes of a faith crisis? Or how your faith crisis fits into the common causes we've talked about today?
I could see people journaling about just getting really clear on what their main causes were and kind of taking the time to write that down.
Mm-hmm.
You'd be using your body to write, you'd be using your brain to articulate it. Knowing really clearly what it was. And by the way, sometimes we think it's church history or social justice, but really there was something more emotional that was deeper. Like I was just not enjoying it, or I was working too hard. So the process of thinking about it, writing about it, journaling about it can help you get to the core reasons. And that's not just valuable so you can complain about all the problems. It's more helping you understand what's important to you, what gets you excited, what feeds you, what's nurturing for you. And it can help point you towards where you want to build your life towards. Maybe it's joining another church. Maybe it's looking at Mormonism as an active Orthodox Mormon in a new, progressive, enlightened way. Maybe going through that journaling thought process can point you towards enlightenment.
Okay.
And help you understand yourself better.
That's great. Something that comes up for me, maybe, as you said, do something with your brain, do something in community, could be that you go to the Gift of the Faith Crisis website and you make a comment there, or you ask a question, or maybe you email us with some ideas for future episodes. But maybe, expressing yourself in a safe place. It could also be with a person or a spouse. But if it's easier, or if it's more accessible for you to go to the website, or if you don't have people like that, feel free to go to the website.
Love that.
And make a comment there and share a bit of your journey.
Love it.
With us there. So those are 2: brain, community.
Love it.
Yeah. Well, and I'll do a brain body combo where, and we kind of mentioned this idea last week when I said, you could take a journal and start in the middle and go backwards both ways, where you write on one hand things that you feel like you learned or were grateful for, or that, you want to carry on with you from, your Mormonism. And then on the other part, you could start writing some of these, what are some of the legitimate things that either harmed me, or that I started questioning, or that I want to reframe, or that I want to abandon, kind of the pioneer cart idea. What do I want to keep in my cart? What do I want to, keep out of my cart? But as you're doing that, especially with the negative piece, can you really tune into what's going on physiologically? So can you do that in a way that you notice, oh, am I getting tense? Am I getting angry as I write? Am I noticing myself like emotionally stimulated, either in a sad way or angry way, or, frustrated way? And as we notice, so can you just notice your body? So where does that show up? Is that in my jaw? Is that in my shoulders? Do I feel heat in my chest? Do I feel like I start getting a headache? So that you can start understanding what cues physiologically your body in particular gives you to just make sense of some of those emotions. I think sometimes we stay too intellectual instead of like letting our body inform us.
Love it.
Great idea.
One final comment. We have Casey, who wrote, I just started journaling 2 weeks ago, and it has been an amazing therapy and so helpful. So yes to journaling with a thumbs up. But also, Casey writes, thank you. I am becoming a subscriber. I'm a newer listener to your podcast. It has been a great source of strength for me. Thank you, Casey. You're going to become donor number 2 after Courtney. So, Casey, you're awesome.
We've got the 2 C's.
And Victoria,
and Casey.
And if Victoria does her single one-time donation, you and Victoria and Casey are going to race to see who can become our second donor. And our third donor. No, we're just kidding. Thank you for the support. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for everyone who supports what we're doing. Please share this. Please write us, email us, comment, give us positive, reviews on Facebook, like us. Please spread the word, and please tune in again next week for another episode of The Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. I'm John Dehlin.
Margi Dehlin.
Natasha Helfer Parker, thanks for being part of our community here.
We'll see you next time.
Take care, everybody. See you soon.
Bye-bye.